Afternoon, and welcome to everybody. My name is Ivan Krastev, and I'm one of the permanent fellows here in the Institute for Human Sciences. And this is going to be our fifth geopolitical talk, which the Institute is doing together with the Ministry of Defense. And when we started this, basically, we wanted to do two things. The first is to try to see the big picture, because there is a lot of things about what is disintegrating and how, what is the world in which we're entering. But we decided to invite people that have two important characteristics. One is that they have an experience in policy making. But on the other side, they're policy intellectuals, people who are reading, who are writing. So this is not simply people that have been negotiating. And I do believe we have a very interesting group of people. But today is, for me, a particular pleasure to present the person who is going to have a talk today. So Bill Burns probably is, everybody said, the most legendary of the living American diplomats. Today, if you see his career, and because he just published his memoirs, a book called Back Channel, which I'm strongly recommending. He didn't ask me for this. This is this is really worth reading, because in a certain way, this is the world seen from the eyes of the diplomat. Not from the president's eyes, not from the eyes of somebody who was occasionally involved in history in a very specific moment, but to try to see how it has been developing. And he has been everywhere where it was interesting. In 1991, 1992, he was the head of the policy planning. And then he did a lot of work, because he speaks Arabic, he speaks Russian. He has been doing the Middle East. He has been twice in Russia, first as a young diplomat, then he was an ambassador. And then basically he was negotiating probably most of the things that we are discussing today, happening or not happening. And for me this is a great opportunity, because I do believe that to what extent the world which we're talking about is a world in which there is a place for diplomacy or not, personally for me is an open question. Because the politics has changed, the communication has changed, the relations between the foreign policy and domestic policy has changed. So what we decided to do is, I'm much more going to insist. I have 4 or 5 kind of major questions that I'm going to ask in order just to frame the way he sees the world. And then after that, we're going to open the discussion, because I see here people who have been sharing kind of decision-making and biographies. And I'll start with something which is not about the future, but which is about the past. So you have been in the policy planning in the moment in which, after the end of the Cold War, there's something that we called the post-Cold War liberal order have been framed. What the liberal order was. Because everybody is saying that it is in crisis, but what it was it simply about American hegemony? Was it simply about institutions? Was it simply a normative framework, the way we have been justifying policies? How this is perceived by somebody who was practicing power within it, and not simply an academic which is trying to describe it. So this is my first question.
Well, thanks. You start with a nice, easy question. But it's wonderful to be with all of you, and thanks so much to Ivan, someone for whom I have great respect, for inviting me, and I look forward very much to the conversation. I think, the liberal international order was not always entirely liberal, and it wasn't, broadly international in the sense that it never aspired to encompass the entire globe. I think in some respects, the order that we knew coming out of the Cold War for at least the quarter century after the end of the Cold War, was in many respects a combination of the kind of ingredients that you talked about. It did occur at a particular moment of, I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance, but uncontested American primacy on the international landscape. It did occur at a moment when I well remember in 1989 when I worked in the policy planning staff, one of my colleagues there was Frank Fukuyama, a wonderful person, but who that later very quickly became famous with his book, The End of History. In the United States, at least, there was a kind of globalization euphoria in that period. There was a sense, unrealistic in many respects, that openness, both in economic and political terms, was the inevitable wave of the future, and it was just a question of time. how far that wave spread in the world. And, we were too slow to understand, I think, the backlash against globalization, the ways in which it didn't necessarily lift all boats and open all political and economic systems. But in many respects, it was a shared sense of optimism, a set of institutions that reflected a commitment to openness. It did reflect that moment of uncontested American primacy. We didn't always use that moment well. We accelerated the end of that era with decisions that we made in Iraq in 2003 and the global financial crisis in 2008. But I think those were among the elements of the order. We didn't appreciate its fragility. We assumed too much about how quickly it would expand across the rest of the international system. And we underestimated the blowback, the backlash against that over time.
Thank you very much. And then I'll move to the future. And the story is the following. I was in the US quite a lot the last year. And what struck me there was, in a period of 4 to 6 months, the way the American foreign policy elite starts to talk about China changed incredibly. I had the feeling that something like this has happened in 1947, of talking about Soviet Union. Before it was an ally, somebody was for, somebody was against. Is it good? Is it an ally? Is it an adversary? And then overnight, everybody is on the same page. It's a major competition. Even the language of the Cold War, people started to calling the Chinese regime the Leninist regime in China, which could be true, but it was not there, 6 months before in the major story. So I'm very much interested how you see, to what extent the China-US competition is really the most structural factor. What is the nature of the competition?
Sure.
To what extent this is a new Cold War, different? So.
Well, you're right about the trend line in thinking in Washington. And in today's Washington, it's a rare achievement when people are united around the same page on anything. The concern I have, first, I'm the last person to differ with the view that strategic competition with China is the central challenge for American statecraft as far out into the 21st century as I can see. It's not, I don't mean to suggest it's the biggest existential challenge out there. I think climate change fills that role. I think the revolution in technology is a huge challenge before the whole of the international community. But I think geopolitically, it's US-China competition. What I worry about, and Ivan, you accurately described, what happens in Washington is anything worth doing is worth overdoing. And so, the center of gravity is shifted in one particularly tough direction. And what I'm concerned about is the same kind of lazy fatalism that caused lots of us to assume too much about the benefits of engagement with China over much of the last 3 decades is causing us now, that same lazy fatalism, to assume too much about the workability of containment or the wisdom of decoupling large parts of our economies or the inevitability of confrontation between the United States and China. As all of you know very well, history is full of collisions between rising powers and established powers. If we're honest with ourselves, there's a very real risk of that in US-China competition. I don't, however, believe that it's foreordained or inevitable. That's the challenge of statecraft. We're out of practice in doing that in the United States, in managing big, complicated, great power relations, because during that unipolar moment, we didn't have to do that so much. We've got to regain that art and those habits, I think, as well. I don't think containment in the classic George Kennan sense, the way in which he looked at the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, applies very well to China. In the sense that Kennan's insight was that in the Soviet system dominated by the Communist Party, the seeds of its own decay were built in. And there were too many internal contradictions that, if contained over time, would cause the implosion of that system. And he was right. It took decades. I don't think you can assume the same thing about China. It's a much deeper civilization, a different kind of nation state, even a different kind of Communist Party authority as well. It's not to underestimate the challenges, that this Chinese leadership, especially Xi Jinping's China, will pose for the United States. But I don't think containment is a useful concept to apply. So I think it's also beyond the capacity of the United States to achieve, to contain China's rise. What I do think is possible is to shape the environment into which China rises. And that's where the United States, if you just look at this in terms of American strategy, has a significant number of assets. You know, there are a huge number of powerful countries across Asia, from India all the way across to Japan, who share an interest in China's rise not coming at the expense of their security and prosperity. And for that matter, I think the United States and Europe, as we look beyond the Trump era, I think, at ways of reinvigorating, reinventing the transatlantic alliance, China's rise poses different kinds of challenges for both of us. I'm not trying to suggest, and this is the kind of classic American way of looking at the world, that we're in a position where we should try to force people to make choices. It's us or the Chinese. Not a very popular notion across Europe today, nor is it a particularly popular notion in Asia right now either. But there is a shared interest, I think, as I said before, in ensuring that China's rise doesn't come at the expense of everybody else's security and prosperity. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean one overarching NATO-like alliance in Asia. That's not going to happen. It's going to require a more sophisticated strategy to build on existing treaty alliances with Japan and South Korea and Australia, but also partnerships, which aren't the same as treaty alliances with big emerging powers like India. And it's going to require working hard to build standards on trade and investment practices. That's why I thought it was a big mistake for the Trump administration to abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade agreement which knit together 40% of the global economy across Asia. Was it a perfect trade agreement? Of course not. Perfect is rarely on the menu in diplomacy or in trade negotiations. But it was a very valuable way, I think, of shaping China's incentives and disincentives over time. And so there are tools out there that I think smart American statecraft can take advantage of. And I also think that China, for all of its strengths, and I don't underestimate for a moment the pace with which China is advancing in artificial intelligence and other incredibly important new forms of technology. But China faces a lot of its own contradictions and challenges over time as well. And the United States, I think, if we can ever get our act together and get out of our own way, has a lot of competitive strengths as well. If we would reinvest in education, especially in science and technology, recover the habit of being able to work with one another in Washington instead of being at each other's throats, demonstrate that governance is actually possible in the United States, to be far less unilateralist in our instincts in looking at the world, but rather to see that what sets us apart from, in effect, lonelier powers like China and Russia is our capacity to draw on alliances and mobilize coalitions of countries. In today's world, beyond the unipolar American moment, those assets are far more important than ever, not just for the United States, but for our partners in Europe as well. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything. It doesn't mean that we're going to move in lockstep, whether it's on 5G issues or anything else. But it does mean that we have to be mindful of the importance of multiplying our influence in the world by working with others. And that means that occasionally we're going to have to listen to other people too, which is also sometimes an unnatural act for Americans.
Just one small question on this. But if it's up to you, how you're going to frame the competition with China? As an ideological competition or as a classical great power competition in which the nature of the regime doesn't matter?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I sound like a recovering diplomat because the answer is a little of both. In the sense that I don't think you can divorce values from the strategy. I do think there are large elements of great power strategy. I'm very skeptical of the tempting notion for Americans of trying to reinvent some grand new bumper sticker for American foreign policy. Everyone's been trying to imitate George Kennan since the late 1940s, and few people have succeeded. And one of the temptations is to see American strategy over the next few decades as basically part of a contest between democracies and autocracies and authoritarian systems. There is that element, because we do have a deep interest in working with, investing in other societies, especially our allies and partners in Europe, who share our commitment to more open political and economic systems. But I think it's a mistake to try to shoehorn every aspect of American statecraft into that broad competition between authoritarian and democratic regimes, in part because, as Nixon and Kissinger demonstrated 45 years ago, one of the ways in which you constrain authoritarian rivals is by playing on their differences. And, I've always thought that even though the relationship, the partnership between Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China today is quite strong, and I don't underestimate that, over time, I've always thought that Russians are going to chafe at being China's junior partner, just as they chafed at being the junior partner of the United States right after the end of the Cold War. So not today, not tomorrow, not next year, but sometime as you look at over the next decade, there's going to be space for artful American diplomacy, I think, in dealing with, the historical differences between Russia and China. So again, I just think we have to be careful not to shoehorn strategy, as appealing as it can be, into kind of neat, all-encompassing concepts.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And you're coming from Russia. Mr. Burns today is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. So he's not writing the memoirs that occupies him at the moment. And you have been the American ambassador in Moscow in 2007, when President Putin gave the famous speech in Munich. So now when you're going back and also reading the book, you can see that you were one of the people who were not, you have your doubts about NATO enlargement, how the relations with Russia should develop or not develop. But on the other side, you're also one reading the book that I have the feeling that said, even if we have done many things differently, nobody can guarantee you that the relations were going to be much more different.
Yeah.
So I'm very much interested in the nature of the relationship, because in the book you have a sentence which I found very important. You said the declining great power could be a much more important destabilizing power than the rising great power. And it was very much based on the Russia comparing China. So how you see the relations with Russia in this world which is much more structured around American-China competition?
Yeah, well, I mean, Putin's Russia poses a particular challenge to the United States. I mean, I vividly remember my first meeting with Vladimir Putin when I was the newly arrived American ambassador in August of 2005 in Moscow. So the meeting takes place in the Kremlin, which is a place, as many of you know, that's built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you walk through these huge ornate halls, down long corridors. You come to the end of one huge hall, and there are these 2-story bronze doors at the end of it. You're kept waiting there for a little while just to let all this sink in. And then the door opens a crack, and out comes President Putin. Now, Putin, despite his bare-chested persona, in the flesh is not all that intimidating. He's about 5'6", even with lifts in his shoes, and but he carries himself with great self-assurance, and so his habit is to look you straight in the eye. And I remember he comes walking through those huge bronze doors, and before I got a word out of my mouth, said, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." That was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But it was a direct message, and it was in many ways the same message as the famous Munich speech in the early 2007. Pugnacious, which is Putin's style. In many respects, in my experience over the years, and President Putin was pretty accessible during the time I was ambassador, so I spent a fair amount of time with him. He was in a way an apostle of payback, in the sense that his view was that the West, in particular the United States, had taken advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness in the 1990s. And I've always thought, if you want to understand the kind of smoldering aggressiveness of Putin's Russia, it helps to have lived in and understood, the curious mix of hope and humiliation that was Boris Yeltsin's Russia in the 90s. Hope, because I think people genuinely believe that the end of communism opened up a lot of opportunities. But humiliation with the collapse of great power status in the world, which matters to Russians just as it does to Americans or anybody else. And so there was this sense when Putin now, literally 20 years ago, became Russia's leader, that he wanted to restore the power of the Russian state first, to take political power at least away from the oligarchs, and then to restore Russia to the table of great powers in the world. And Putin is tactically very agile. People always, when they try to explain Putin, look to his training as a KGB professional, and that's certainly part of understanding who Putin is. But he's also a judo specialist, and like any good judo specialist, he understands how you take advantage of the strengths of stronger opponents. And in some ways, in dealing with the United States, that's what he's done. When we make mistakes, when we provide openings, he takes advantage of them. So for Putin, he draws a straight line from that conviction that Russia was taken advantage of in the 90s, through the color revolutions, Georgia 2003, Ukraine in 2004, which he wrongly, I think, I'm convinced, saw as orchestrated by the United States to limit Russia, to keep Russia down, all the way to the US elections in 2016. So when he saw an opportunity to take advantage of American dysfunction, he wasn't going to resist the temptation. He's become less risk averse, more risk tolerant as time has gone on. I think this is the last thing I'd say about Putin, and I'm sorry to go on so long. I also think that history may judge him a lot more harshly than people do today when they look at that tactical agility, which is real. But strategically, I think Putin failed to take advantage of the moment when I was ambassador a decade ago, when he was surfing on $130 a barrel oil. That was a moment when Russia could have diversified its economy. What he's left with today is a pretty one-dimensional economy so you get a boost in oil prices as a result of the current crisis in the Persian Gulf, but that's not a sustainable basis to be competitive in the 21st century. Even on issues like Ukraine, where, he basked in the popular reaction in Russia to the annexation of Crimea. So he swallowed up 2.5 million Crimeans. He's also ensured that the other 42 million Ukrainians never again are going to accept a predominant Russian influence over their security and political and economic choices. And I think over the long term, that comes at Russia's strategic expense. He's put a lot of eggs in the China basket today, and over time, I think Russia, as in many respects a declining power, has an objective interest in healthier relations, not just with Europe, but with the United States, alongside, a strong relationship with China, if it's going to, maximize its own leverage in the world. So it's a very mixed picture, but I'd never underestimate, Putin as someone to deal with. And I think President Trump, the really unfortunate thing, you may recall the summit meeting in Helsinki a little more than a year ago between Trump and Putin, when Trump stood up on stage in front of the international media and essentially threw under the bus 17 US law enforcement and intelligence agencies and said essentially he trusted Putin's judgment about who interfered in the 2016 elections more than his own intelligence and law enforcement agencies. He saw that, Trump, I think, saw that as a way to build the personal relationship that enables big players in the world to do deals with one another. Putin, I think, saw that as a sign of weakness and manipulability. And if you could have seen the cartoon balloon coming out of his head, it would have said, "What an easy mark." And that's, I think, really unfortunate. So, I think you have to be realistic about U.S.-Russia relations looking out over the next few years. It's going to operate within a pretty narrow band of possibilities, as I said before. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't focus on preserving a safety net in that relationship, which is why I think it's urgently important to restart negotiations on the extension of the New START agreement, which expires at the beginning of 2021, which regulates, reduces, makes more transparent the strategic nuclear arsenals that both the United States and Russia have. So we need to work at that, despite quite serious differences between us.
Thank you very much. I just want to make one, because when you say that you should try to understand how they felt in the 1990s, to understand the intensity of the reactions, not what they're doing, but why they're doing in the way they're doing it. In my view, as somebody who have been going to Russia time to time, there are two things that are quite interesting. One is, it is never nice to lose a war, but it's even more difficult when after that you should pretend that you have been winning too. And this was a very difficult story, because in a certain way the official narrative of the end of the Cold War was, we all are winners. Russian people and the West against communism. But for the ex-Soviet elites being totally marginalized of taking decisions, you can tolerate it for a while, but you can tolerate it under two conditions. Either economic situation changes very positively, or if they have kept the Soviet Union together. Because I do believe what people underestimate is to what extent opening and basically reapproachment to the West for Gorbachev was the way to keep Soviet Union together, because he said the West as being anti-nationalist, particularly European Union, telling basically everybody that nation state is something of the past. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting. And then I'll go to my two last questions, because they're going to, one is about Europe.
And I just add two very quick things on Russia, because first, none of what I said about understanding at least some of what animates Vladimir Putin and large parts of the Russian political elite today is a justification or an excuse for Putin's aggression in Ukraine or in Georgia in the summer of 2008. So understanding motivations isn't the same as indulging or accepting those attitudes. And then the second thing is just to reinforce what you said, Ivan, and that is that we told ourselves that the end of the Cold War had only winners. But the reality is, I remember in Russia in the 1990s, most Russians didn't feel much like winners. I remember, as the chief political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and the winner of 1994-95 during the first Chechen War, going to Grozny. I never saw devastation quite like that. I've seen a lot of bad things as a diplomat over the years, but these were photographs that looked like Dresden 1945. The center of Grozny, 40 square blocks had been leveled by Russian bombardment. The Russian general responsible for that had said he wanted to make the rubble bounce, and he did. Unfortunately, most of the civilians killed in central Grozny were elderly ethnic Russians who couldn't escape and couldn't get out of the city. But it was as awful a human scene as I've ever seen. But it was also a scene in which here was the Russian military, the Red Army, that during the height of the Cold War was supposed to be able to get to the English Channel in 48 hours. And they were having enormous difficulty suppressing a localized rebellion in a far-off part of Russia. And that sense of humiliation stuck with a lot of people in the Russian political elite as well.
Thank you very much. I'll go to the European relations, and I wanted to go to Russia for an important story. I saw the latest opinion polls, and basically, ECFR polled before the European elections in 14 EU member states, the biggest states and also the sizable representative for Central and Eastern Europe, basically without the Baltics and Bulgaria. Only 5% of the Europeans has a total confidence in the US security guarantees. And I saw the latest American polling in where only 28% of the Americans believe that the American military power is basically a force for good. So we are living in a strange situation in which the institutions are there, NATO is there, the world is changing, but both sides for different reasons either don't trust each other, but also don't trust their own kind of policies and military and so on. So I'm asking this because for Europe, one of the major questions now is what is all this story about the strategic autonomy of the European Union? Mm-hmm. I was listening to President Macron recently, and he said, when it comes to Russia, European Union should decouple. We cannot rely on the Americans. In order not to be squeezed between the Americans and the Chinese, to have some room for maneuvering, we should try to make a deal with Russia. My story is first how realistic it is. I'm not asking on normative level. What you can achieve, to what extent European Union really has this option. if you're seeing from the American perspective?
Well, I mean, I'd say a couple of general things first. I mean, I think, it's a huge mistake for both Americans and Europeans to somehow see the relationship between us as less important as you move out into the 21st century. It's a relationship that's going to be different than it was during the Cold War or during the last 30 years. But in many respects, I think it's more important in a world in which the rise of China, climate change, the insecurities that spill out of the Middle East and could spill out of Africa when its population doubles by the middle of this century to 2 billion people. We have, as strong a shared stake in dealing effectively with those challenges as we do with any other players in the world. I say that as an American, but I think the same is true of Europeans. I recognize that there is a real risk today that Europeans will see shifts in American attitudes reflected in polling as being not just the product of one person in the White House, Donald Trump, but as reflecting a structural change. Americans are less willing to sacrifice in foreign policy, less interested in Europe, less interested in engagement in the world. And there is a real fatigue in the United States. And Trump has tapped a chord. When he pushes back on the issue of defense spending amongst NATO partners, he's tapping a chord that's quite popular across party lines in the United States. So to the extent strategic autonomy or whatever term you use can actually produce in security terms European military commitments that are stronger, at least relative to what they are today, that's actually not a bad selling point, politically in the United States right now. And it makes people, I think, more willing to accept, in effect, less control. Because, as Americans, we're quite accustomed to dictating to others, and we can be kind of patronizing in terms of, what NATO policy should look like. And we're going to have to learn to be a little bit more accommodating. But the way to trigger that, I think, is to demonstrate that, that sense of whatever you call it, European strategic autonomy, is producing, more capacity in security terms. We're not always going to see every issue eye to eye, and I think we're going to have to, in some ways, reinvent the transatlantic alliance. I don't mean scrap institutions that still matter to both of us, like NATO, certainly the European Union for Europeans. But I think you see a really dangerous tendency in the person of President Trump today, who's essentially a unilateralist at heart, whose view of the world is that, we're like Gulliver tied down by all the Lilliputians, alliances and institutions, and that all those alliances and institutions actually constrain America's ability to exercise its influence and pursue its interests in the world. I think that is a deeply misguided notion. I think it's incredibly foolish for the president to have become, in effect, the biggest cheerleader for Brexit. I don't think it does any favors for Britain. I don't think it does any favors for Anglo-American relations or for the European Union. We have a stake in the success of the European project, and we, like Europeans, have to recognize that it faces some pretty big challenges today. In effect, we're having nervous political breakdowns on both sides of the Atlantic today. I was in London a couple of weeks ago, and it's the one capital that can actually make you feel good about Washington today, because it's which is saying something. So I think we need to reanimate, maybe on both sides of the Atlantic, our cold-blooded, unsentimental recognition that transatlantic partnership matters. And we're not going to be able to just return to the status quo ante after Trump. We're both going to have to adjust. But I don't think it's impossible to make those adjustments. And I think it's really crucial, because it's hard for me to see as an American how we deal with all the challenges we've been talking about, from China to climate change to the Middle East, unless we're working more effectively with European partners.
My last question is about the United States, and this is not about Trump. It's very much about, nevertheless, who comes after Trump. Because obviously something much more deep is changing. Structurally, the way America sees the world, the limits of the American power that people say, the feeling that America, and I do believe here Trump also touched on something real. The talk was the America is leader the vote, and then suddenly America said, we're not the leader, we're the hostage. And then my story is, and you have the young generation, which I was seeing also the opinion polls, the level of patriotism is much lower than the previous generation. The idea is that we are not exceptionally good to teach others how to live or not to live. So what kind of a foreign policy, what is going to be the new foreign policy consensus? Forget what if Trump is going to be re-elected. Imagine that it's going to be anybody on the Democratic side but Biden. Because Biden is something probably that was before. I don't know how good it is for the world, but imagine that a new figure is coming. What are the choices that they're going to make? And of course, here is the gossip that you probably, most of you know better than me, but before the 2016 elections, one of the famous kind of gossip was that you were going to be the Secretary of State if Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. Probably it was not true, but the gossips are not about truth, they're about kind of, it's a gossip. So the story is, what are the choices? If Elizabeth Warren is going to be the President of the United States, what she's going to choose between what and what?
Yeah, well, I think they're hard choices for Americans, no matter who gets elected. I mean, in the sense that first you have to diagnose the international landscape on which we're operating, and it is a landscape that's no longer one in which the United States has uncontested primacy, and you have to recognize that. Now, that's not the same as suggesting that we have a poor hand to play. I again, don't mean this as a statement of American hubris, but I still think the United States has a better hand to play geopolitically than any of our major rivals. The question is how well we play it, and we're playing it exceptionally poorly today, I think. So that's one, to understand that on that landscape, we still have the capacity to be the pivotal player, you know, the major power that has at least the opportunity to exercise influence working with partners and allies on more issues and in more parts of the world than anybody else does. At the same time, we've got to couple that with a sense of discipline, which has eluded us a lot in the past because we have overreached. I mean, that was the lesson of Iraq in 2003. It was, you know, it's been the lesson of other experiences in other parts of the world in administrations of both parties. We're going to have to match ends to means in a lot more rigorous fashion than we've done before, because we're going to have to husband our resources. The third thing is, you know, we're going to have to reinvigorate our sources of competitive strength in the United States. We've got to rediscover the capacity to govern effectively and get beyond our dysfunctions in Washington. Anybody who's been to the United States recently can see the huge need for infrastructure improvements, and it's ridiculous that we haven't managed as a political system to address some of those challenges. So, you know, part of the challenge for whomever gets elected, and, you know, it's possible President Trump could get reelected. Yeah. If one of his Democratic contenders or rivals gets elected, the first part is obviously winning the election, but then you've got to be able to heal, or at least help heal, a deeply divided political society and govern. Because unless you can do those second and third things, you know, it's a prescription for a lot of trouble over time. And I think, and here, you know, this is the self-interested argument of a recovering diplomat, but I think we have to have a better balance amongst the tools that we employ in pursuing foreign policy interests in the world. Obviously, you never get any place in diplomacy unless it's backed up by military and economic leverage. We don't live in a sentimental world. But we've gotten in a very bad habit, especially since the terrible attacks on 9/11, of kind of militarizing our diplomacy and inverting the roles of force and diplomacy. Diplomacy isn't always going to produce results. It's not always going to succeed, but it ought to be the tool of first resort. What you explore first before, you know, you resort to the use of the U.S. military. So when I talk about discipline and a more rigorous application of, you know, American influence and power in the world, getting that balance right is going to be really important, and that's more remote than ever today. I mean, you know, the most recent budget proposal from the Trump White House suggested a Pentagon budget 19 times bigger than the combined budget for diplomacy and development assistance in the world. Bob Gates, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, used to remind people that there are more members of American military bands than there are American diplomats today. I have nothing against military music, but there's an imbalance there. And also, I really do worry about the hollowing out of my old institution, the State Department, where you have not only a 40% drop in applications by young Americans to join the Foreign Service after 20 years in which it rose every year, but you have everything from a very pernicious practice of going after individual career personnel just because they worked on controversial issues like the Iran nuclear agreement in the last administration, and painfully slow trend lines toward creating a more diverse diplomatic service that looks more like the society we represent overseas. You know, when I entered the Foreign Service in the early 1980s, 9 out of 10 American diplomats looked like me. They were white males. 1 in 4 were women. We made painfully slow progress. 35 years later, when I left, you know, the gender balance was better, the ethnic diversity was more impressive, although still woefully inadequate. But those trends have been reversed over the course of the last 3 years. So there are opportunities to do all of those things. But, you know, I don't envy the challenge of a new president because we've dug a deep hole for ourselves. And again, Donald Trump didn't invent a lot of the problems I was describing. He's accelerated them and made them worse. But the problem with digging holes for ourselves, one of my early mentors in the Foreign Service used to say that, you know, when you're in a hole and you want to get out, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Well, we're still digging right now. We'll stop eventually, whether it's in 2020 or whenever. The problem, though, is going to be, it's not like the rest of the world has been waiting passively while we've been digging. We will climb back to the top of the hole and look out on a landscape that's hardened against our interests and in some respects against the values that ought to matter to Americans. So the sooner we stop digging, the better.
Thank you very much. So we'll go to the most interesting part, your questions. I'm going to ask just people to introduce themselves. And just one sentence, because this is the sentence that remained from me coming back from the US. There was a senior person from the Obama Pentagon in her early 50s. And she was talking about the difference between her and her daughter when you talk security. And she said, when I was 17, 18 years old, every month we were training to go to the bunker of the school because we have been basically training how to react in a situation of a Soviet nuclear attack. And she said, my daughter is also doing this twice per month, but the threat that they're responding to is a school shooting. And I do believe this is also telling you something very much about the socialization of these ideas of threat. So please, you can start. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Mitchell Ash. As you can hear, I'm an American, but I've been teaching modern history here for the past 20 years.
Nice to meet you.
2 questions. I'll keep them very brief, don't worry.
It's okay.
The first is about economics, which hasn't been discussed yet, and the second is about law, which has been discussed by implication, but not directly. So the economic question, when you talk about rising and declining powers, you mentioned financial leverage. A nation that is as deeply in debt as the United States can't really be said to have the financial leverage that many Americans think that it has. And if you add to that a fact that is not known to very many people inside or outside the United States, that a large amount of the national debt of the United States is held by the Chinese, it seems to me that this is a serious question. So I would like you to make some remarks about the economic dimensions of this. And the second question relates to law, specifically to international law. If we look at what's happening at the Ukraine, in the eastern Ukraine today, one of the businesses of this institute is to think about this particular part of the world. One is tempted to paraphrase a statement Mao once made about the Pope. How many divisions does international law have?
Well, not many. I mean, to get to your second question first, the application, at least, the defense of international law is connected to geopolitics in the sense of norms that are supported by enough of the principal players in the international system not as an abstraction, but because it serves their self-interest as well. And we're in a particularly, I think, treacherous period for that right now, given the number of international norms which have been violated in recent years. So rebuilding, that sense of broad commitment to laws, whether it's in warfare or other issues, is incredibly important. And then there's a whole new set of challenges, for example, in the revolution in technology. How do you begin to develop workable rules of the road and ultimately international legal precepts which can support the kind of rules and norms which maximize the benefits of technology and minimize the dislocations? So it's a pretty precarious period, I think, in international law. You're absolutely right about the economic roots, not just of national power and influence, but also the changes in the global economy, which are having a huge impact on order in the world today. And you're right about the United States and China. I mean, the only thing I'd add is that China has a huge debt overhang of its own, and so in a sense, we have guns pointed at each other's head right now, which is not a very healthy, way of looking at the economy. Unless the United States recovers a capacity for budget discipline and, a willingness to invest in priorities, to use government for sensible purposes, investing in education, investing in science and technology, it's going to be harder and harder for us to compete economically as well in the world too. So I don't think those are impossible tasks, but we have a pretty steep hill to climb in restoring that budget discipline, especially in an incredibly polarized political climate, and especially when especially the Republican Party has developed selective amnesia about what used to be one of their precepts, which was budget discipline and avoiding huge deficits, which this administration is continuing to pile up. So it's a huge challenge, and I didn't mean to give short shrift to it in the earlier part of the conversation. There's no way in which the United States can navigate effectively on the international landscape unless we're able to reinvigorate our own sources of economic strength.
Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. We overlapped in Moscow. I was there from 2003 to 18.
Nice
so
to
I remember your tenure.
Very nice to see you.
You mentioned earlier that China is surrounded by a number of countries that would have an interest in perhaps forming some sort of partnership with the United States to keep Chinese power in check.
Yeah, I don't mean a singular partnership. No. It's more grayer than that, I think, but share a broad interest.
Understood. Well, and let's put it this way: a number of countries that would be wary about overwhelming Chinese interest and might be interested in looking for partners abroad. You didn't mention Russia, which is a great partner of China right now, but it's a tenth the population, it's a sixth the economy, and it's shrinking. And last time I checked, there are any number of Chinese cities that have more people in them than Siberia, than Russia east of the Urals. Do you think it would be mad to think that the alliance of the future would be the United States and Russia to keep China in check? Well, if Nixon could do it with Mao, and Begin could do it with Sadat, perhaps it's not mad.
Well, I suppose it depends on how far out into the future you look. I mean, in the near term, I don't think much chance of that. I mean, you're right about Russia's historical sense of insecurity and, potential friction with China. I mean, you mean the practical realities are pretty vivid that, east of the Urals, across all of Siberia and the Russian Far East, there's only about 35, 40 million Russians sitting on just about everything in the periodic table of elements and looking across a very long border at 1.4 billion Chinese. So, over time, there's a sense of vulnerability there that spills over into the nature of Russian-Chinese partnership. So, as I think I mentioned before, I mean, I do think there's space for artful American diplomacy if we can recover that habit in dealing with Russia and China. And just as, Nixon and Kissinger's insight was to see that the communist world was not a monolith and Soviet-Chinese tensions were then becoming pretty obvious, we have to be mindful of the potential tensions between Russia and China. And, it stands to reason that for Russia as well, it doesn't have a long-term interest in putting all of its strategic eggs in the Chinese basket. I mean, that's why the Putin's Russia works today to try to build, to the extent it can, its relationships with Japan and India. It's why Russia, over the long term, has an interest in a healthier relationship with Europe and ultimately, I think, with the United States. I just don't want to predict that, in the next few years, you're going to see any of that being possible.
Okay. So, I know about 3 persons.
So thank you very much first for your comments. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz. I'm a professor of geopolitics at the University of Amsterdam and a visiting fellow here. And I wanted to kind of pick up on Ivan's points about the European Union.
Yes.
And as the new commission takes shape and also gives shape to whatever geopolitical vision it's going to have, I guess the question to you would be, what can the EU do to help the United States out of this hole? Is it just simply already, kind of healing internal divisions with regards to relationships with Russia and China? Or is there something more in terms of, reaching out to at least part of the foreign policy community in the United States?
Yeah, I think part of it just has to do with, restoring the health of the European Union and dealing with a lot of the challenges that, again, as all of you know far better than I do, the EU faces right now, to demonstrate that the European Union is capable of restoring its own health. Maybe that'll have a good, demonstration effect for Americans because we face some of the same challenges. I think on specific issues, just as an example, I think President Macron is playing a constructive role on the Iran issue, which we haven't talked about, but certainly has the potential to blow up in a very physical way. And I think it's important for European leaders, and I think Macron has an especially good touch with President Trump, to try to find ways to break some of our worst instincts and some of the Iranian leadership's worst instincts too. And I think in other areas in dealing with China, there's been not quite as stark a shift in European views of the China challenge as there's been in the United States, but my impression is there's been a shift. And so to find ways in which we can talk more constructively to one another about that challenge. Now, that's not going to mean that Europeans are going to be eager to embrace American policies on Huawei or 5G, but we ought to be having a more thorough, serious discussion about those issues too, where we can at least, work together rather than totally at cross purposes on some of those issues too. So I think there are a lot of ways in which we can preserve for people on both sides of the Atlantic a sense of what's at stake here, for both Europeans and Americans, and hopefully preserve them for a better day.
Ivan,
Hello. Ambassador Ivan Vejvoda, permanent fellow here at the Institute. Thank you for the clarity and sobriety of your analysis. It's most welcome. But I'd like to
It's amazing how much smarter you get after you leave government. Everything is so clear. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about your current day job.
Mm-hmm.
You, as Ivan said, you run one of the preeminent institutions, think tanks in Washington. How has that world, where, as you know, I also worked for 6 years, I left Washington on the day of the inauguration of the president. How has that...
Just a coincidence.
Everybody thought I had premeditated it.
Yeah.
It was serendipitous.
We hope that he does not know it.
How has that world changed, and how do you see the role of institutions like Carnegie and others today?
It's a really good question, and as you know, I have great admiration for the German Marshall Fund too. It's a much more, not just in the US, but internationally, the think tank, public policy institution landscape is much more crowded, louder, more contested in some ways than it was 15 or 20 years ago. We also operate in an environment, especially in the US, where truth is seems to be a more relative concept in the Trump era, in which expertise is held much more in question than it was before. And therefore, it's a more complicated environment. It's also an environment in which, again, in American terms, a lot of think tanks tend to get typed one way or the other, whether it's because of a particular political party, a particular set of donors, or anything else. And so that's also a reality. Carnegie's role, we've been around Carnegie Endowment since 1910. Our distinctive features, it seems to me, are two. One, we aspire at least to be a global institution. So we have 6 centers around the world now. And we aspire, at least, we don't always succeed in this, in trying to see problems not just through the prism of Washington, but from the perspective of lots of other important parts of the world. Now, I say that with humility because, I was an American diplomat for 35 years, so it's hard for me to escape that past. We also do not have significant operations in either Africa or Latin America. We're not as strong as we should be in geoeconomic issues or in issues of technology and its impact. So we're working on all of those things too. But I think in this environment, being a more global institution is actually a big asset. Second, we really aspire to be an independent institution, so not beholden to any one government, any one political party, any one donor or set of donors. That's increasingly difficult to do in this day and age, but it's extremely important. So we're really careful about foreign government money, or not because there's anything morally wrong with that. I don't believe there is. You just have to be careful. But because in this day and age it opens you up to criticism. And the same is true with regard to big corporate donations as well. Because oftentimes you can at least get accused of being guilty of pay for play, that your outcomes are being shaped by those who support it. So it's a complicated landscape to navigate, but it's also, I think, as important a role as at any moment in my professional life too, because you want to restore some sense of respect, not only for expertise, but also for fact-based analysis, in a world, in a Washington at least, in which alternative facts are popular things.
I have a suggestion. Let's see who wants to get the floor now, because I want to be sure that everybody who wants to ask a question is going to ask a question. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's have Holly, and then is it okay if then I'm going to ask everybody to ask questions? I'm going to give you, because I'm afraid I don't want to waste a lot of time, but I want to be sure that everybody is going to ask questions. So Holly, yeah.
I'm Holly Case. I teach at Brown. I used to teach at Cornell. And my question is practical. In my 15 plus years of teaching, I've never encountered a student who wanted to go into government. And it worries me that none of my students who are very smart and who are the sort of people that I would want to do that. And so my question is basically, I think a lot of them want to do something. They want to make some kind of difference. A lot of them maybe think, okay, government isn't the place to do it. What are the places in government where you can push on a door and it actually opens? And how would one think about preparing for a position like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you can tell, notwithstanding all the headwinds against it, I'm still a huge believer in public service. I spent 35 years as a professional diplomat, and I genuinely love that profession. I wouldn't trade it. I'd trade some moments of the experience. But it's a world in which I see the same thing that you do, a drop in applications of people who want to join the U.S. Foreign Service. Now, the reality, again, as you know, is that there are far more opportunities in a way to make a difference, to engage in international affairs, or in public service, broadly speaking, than there were when I entered the Foreign Service. The NGO community is very active. There are international institutions. There are lots of ways in which you can make a contribution. But I think for Americans, public service still matters enormously. And so, to be honest, part of the reason I wrote this book was to try to bring diplomacy and diplomatic service to life for people. You could write a very academic treatise, and some people could do that very well. I couldn't, about diplomacy and what it means. What I was trying to do is bring to life, in part through my own experiences, what that life is like, and the satisfactions along with the frustrations and the sacrifices that you and your families have to make. So I hope that we can reverse that trend. I hope we can find, especially in the best American universities like Brown or Cornell or others, more of an interest in public service. This administration is not the best advertisement I've seen for public service. And especially for, the sort of current generation, my wife and I have 2 daughters who are in their mid-20s, and I don't expect that either of them is going to do one thing for 35 years like I did. And so it means that institutions like the State Department are going to have to be more flexible in encouraging people who may want to serve for briefer periods of time or to come in at the middle levels of their careers rather than trying to force everyone to come in at the entry level. So public institutions are going to have to become more flexible to attract the best of the next generation to it. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think it's incredibly important for the future of our society. And I'm sure that's true in European societies as well.
So now we're going to collect all the questions. So
may I still ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think that all of Europe sighed with relief when Mr. Bolton was fired. Can you tell us something, inside knowledge about Mr. O'Brien? How do we have to fear him also, or is he less dangerous?
Should I be really quick on that one?
Yeah, you can quick.
Yeah, no. I mean, I worked with John Bolton twice in my career, in Baker's time and then in Powell's time. And he's a very smart guy. He knows the bureaucracy incredibly well, so he's a formidable player. The other thing I'd say about him is he'll never stab you in the back. It'll usually be right in the chest. So he makes, he's at least honest about his deeply ideological views. I don't know Mr. O'Brien, the new National Security Advisor. I think what President Trump has created increasingly is a system in which, he's surrounded by people who are going to support his instincts rather than question them. And this is not an argument for keeping John Bolton in that job, but you have to be careful what you wish for sometimes in thinking that President Trump, liberated and unfettered, his instincts, at least in foreign policy, are going to be a good thing. But I don't know O'Brien.
Is it a risk to his career
to
try this job?
I can't.
All his predecessors have been sort of eliminated fast.
Yeah, no, 4 in 3 years is a record for American presidents. So I don't know. People always, the best motive is they want to serve their country. Working in the White House can also be kind of addictive. But I just think you got to, anyway.
He can at least
in this
write
White
a
House, you
memoir.
have to be pretty careful about that.
Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador. My name is Mark Vanig. I was 23 years in the Foreign Service, just
nice
retired.
to see
I
you.
live right down the road here, retired in Vienna.
That's great.
And
You're not missing anything in Washington.
I sure am not.
Yeah.
I get MSNBC here, I have to tell you, which I'm very happy about. My concern, the New York Times had a very interesting op-ed today called My Love Letter to the State Department. I'm sure you've read it.
I saw.
It was in reaction to a lot of the high-profile resignations we've had recently. I was with USIA before, till 99, and of course our motto was telling America's story to the world.
Right.
And I want to know, what would you tell our colleagues about representing American values at a time like this? It's really, really tough.
It is.
And I think I was very close to retirement when Trump got elected. I don't know even if I would have stayed on.
Yeah.
It's really, really tough. And I guess I thought today's article was a little bit, we're tough. She even mentioned values in the article. I almost choked when I read that part.
Yeah.
What is your thought? What are your thoughts about
Well,
that?
I mean, the short answer is when people ask me that question in the State Department, I encourage them to hang in there. This isn't going to last forever. It's the role of a career service to serve whomever gets elected. I don't think I've ever seen a more challenging environment than this one. I think it's much more difficult the more senior you get. I mean, just speaking personally, I would have had an extremely hard time serving at a senior level where publicly you're having to defend the indefensible. I have huge respect for people who, especially at whatever level, but who have decided to resign. It's relatively rare, as you well know, in the U.S. Foreign Service for people to resign. There were about 20 over the Balkans in the 90s, 3 over the Iraq War in 2003. But it's and Vietnam a bigger number. You're right. You're exactly right. Right. I was just thinking of my own professional experience, but you're right. I have huge respect for people who make that choice, and it's not easy to do. I mean, it's also a function of families and responsibilities and everything else. But to answer your question, I generally do all I can to encourage, especially more junior and middle level officers, to stay. What breaks my heart more than anything is when you see mid-level officers, they've been serving 12, 13, 14 years, start to leave. That's the future of that institution. And that in any professional institution gets very hard to deal with, because those are the people you want to be your ambassadors 15 years from now. And we'll wake up and find that it's hard to undo that damage. So without comment on that particular article, I hope people will hang in there.
Please.
Tamás Fóti, I'm a
Hello.
Hungarian journalist based in Vienna. Probably as you know, there are plans to restart the Hungarian service of Radio Free Europe.
Mm-hmm.
What role can you see for the radio? What is speaking about American values, exporting the values?
Oh, Radio Free Europe. I mean, I've always thought they're healthy institutions. I mean, they have a different role today than was the case during the Cold War. So I think investing in independent journalism, in honest views being transmitted, especially in societies where they're in short supply, is really important too.
Hi, Larry
Hi.
Paulson. I can't identify where I'm from because apparently the ethics officer of my agency says I have to be careful about comments I make in public. So,
I see.
But I live in Vienna. So my question is, this is probably a little bit unusual, but you're here, so we'll ask it. See,
Sure.
I remember the discussion about you being in the policy planning department at the State Department.
Yeah, long time ago.
Yeah. And you're talking about Kennan and the long telegram, and then you mentioned Frank Fukuyama's book on Native history. How much do academic works like that, or I guess they were State Department people, but works that are scholarly like that, and I'm thinking more recently, for example, Graham Allison's book on the Thucydides trap, right, which I'm assuming is also informing the discussion about China a lot. How much do those affect or inform policymaking decisions or discussions in the State Department?
I mean, unfortunately, less than you think sometimes. Even when I was on the policy planning staff in Baker's time, and it was a period when that staff was probably as influential as it's been since Kennan's time. We're bigger, Baker, partly because he distrusted some other parts of the State Department, tended to rely more on that staff, and even more importantly, because the world was changing so dramatically, so fast. But even then, policy planning, long-range planning was kind of what you're doing next week, as opposed to, thinking more conceptually about where you want to go. So I think in the best of times in the State Department, any institution, people pay attention to more academic works like that, simply because in government, at least in my experience, you're oftentimes the victim of your inbox and dealing with the crisis of the moment. And so there's Kissinger's famous line that you don't produce new intellectual capital in government, you're draining what you brought in. He had a lot to drain, so I mean, more than most, I suppose. But so there's a reality to that too, which means that a smart leadership in the State Department, for example, will try to interact with people outside and draw on their strengths in ways that complement, what people are capable of in government when they're straining just to keep up with the crisis of the moment.
Hi, I'm Miles Starr. I'm American. I live in Vienna, and you discussed to stop digging the hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
And also looking into the future, and then looking into the near future. One other comment you made was about you didn't think it was a good idea for Trump to be supporting Brexit.
Yeah.
Sort of an alternative view, or a question I have is if I sort of see it that U.S. society has suffered, but not enough to totally dismiss Trump the way maybe Austrian or German society dismissed the Nazi ideology. So imagining that Brexit does happen with no deal, and there's a catastrophe, food shortages, medicine shortages, economic collapse, I could see that discrediting Trump. And at this moment, Britain is a pretty small player on the world stage. And then for the sake of China, the EU actually, and the US, actually Brexit happening with no deal is the only way to sort of stop the illiberal tide that's going on. So I don't imagine with a deal Brexit that kind of is the same business as things going on, that the right in the EU or in the US would be tampered down at all?
Yeah, I mean, I just hate to think that it takes a unforced error, a self-inflicted crisis to produce that kind of a realization. That's the challenge of good leadership, is to try to help people see beyond that, so that it's, there are any number of examples of crises that have then forced people to draw back from a political or economic abyss. I just hope it doesn't come to that.
We have the last question.
Hi.
Thanks a lot. Thanks indeed
Sure.
for your fair thoughts. I have a question, very shortly, because we're at the end. Does politics and government speak in United States with industries, and especially with Silicon Valley industries? Because I've been there at Open University producing a few series of a movie, and from all these big giants I have heard one word and not anything else. We want disruption. I didn't get what kind of disruption they want, but it has a political meaning. And do you deal with that in your scientific or? Yeah, that's the question. Thanks.
No, it's a very good question, and I think there's still a pretty big gap, just talking about American society, between public policy, the public sector, government, and the world of technology. Yeah, but I'll just speak to it from the point of view of the United States. Now, I think that's beginning to change. Even 5 or 6 years ago, when I'd go out to Silicon Valley when I was in government, there was a kind of dismissiveness on the part of disruptors in Silicon Valley, especially the founders' generation. Their view was, we're revolutionaries, we're remaking the world, just stay out of our way. And to be fair, in the public policy side, there was a pretty vast ignorance of the world of technology. And I spent a lot of time in the White House Situation Room and high-level meetings, basically collectively faking it. Part of a lot of, pretty smart people and dedicated, but who just didn't have a feel for the world of technology in the way that I think is necessary. Now, what's changing is that on the technology side, people have been a little bit humbled, by various scandals in recent years. Some of the biggest US technology companies have stepped on landmines overseas, whether it's in terms of European Commission regulation or anything else. So they've started to discover that they need to have a little bit better feel for public policy. And similarly, on the government side, there's clearly a sense that you need to develop a cadre of people who have a feel for the world of technology, because there's no way in which you can help develop workable rules of the road internationally unless you have a feel for the pace with which biotechnology, artificial intelligence is going to change. Yeah, so it's not moving fast enough, that realization on both sides. I think one of the big challenges for American diplomacy, for the State Department, if you end up with a new administration, is going to be, how do you accelerate those efforts so that you develop the cadre of people inside government, which basically is not going to mean you're going to get people that are going to spend 35 years like I did, coming out of Silicon Valley. They get paid too well, and it's the incentive to stay working in the private sector is too strong. But you can get people to come for a couple years as a matter of public service, and so you're going to have to be flexible enough to do that as well. And then in the world of technology, I think there is emerging a sense that they have a lot at stake in beginning to understand how you work with government a little bit more too. So, I'm hopeful. What I worry about, though, is that we're not going to move at the pace that we need to.
I have a story before I'm going to ask you to think. And this is a story which I was keeping for the end because it makes a very strong impression on me. During this stay in the US, I was talking to somebody close to this administration. I said, how are you going to describe to me how radical is the change in foreign policy making? And he said, listen, there was this guy, Bill Burns, probably you have heard about. He was serving 10 Secretary of States, Republican Democrats, nevertheless who comes to power on certain type of an issue, he's going to be called, because the idea of the institutional memory and so on was there. And he said, you should know that the chance that he's going to be called by the President Trump is slightly higher than President Trump is going to call you. And I do believe, and he was not making, it was not about Bill Burns. Yeah. It was about the fact that certain type of institutional memory and the idea of the experience that matters was over. And it's not about Democrats, Republicans, because if you see the last page of the book of Bill Burns, you're going to see all the Secretary of States that he's been serving for the last 30 years praising the book and saying that it was great for them. So it is whole consensus that was buried. It was not that one party lost to another party. It was not that one kind of idea of a foreign policy, the very idea of the wisdom of certain type of a foreign policy establishment was criminalized. And the more respected you are, and you were in this type of a circles, in a certain way, the less likely it is that your advice is going to be asked. And I'm saying this because I do believe that this is type of a change which is not on the level of policy, but on the idea of what makes you legitimate. The very fact that you have a national security advisor, whom basically very few people know anything about, is what you're looking for. You're looking for somebody whom nobody knows. And this is a legitimacy issue. And I'm making this point not to praise you, but just to say that in a certain way, probably we're seeing a much more radical change than when we're talking about policies. Because policies look much closer than they were, but in a certain way, the change is probably much more profound. I want you to thank to Bill Burns, and I want to tell you how proud you are that you accepted our invitation.